Our first set of pictures is from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Civil rights activist John Lewis, who is depicted in this first picture, was arrested more than 40 times protesting discrimination and racist laws. In this first image, we see him on crossing a street holding a sign, "One man, one vote." Allow Negroes democratic right, register to vote. He is an African-American man, a young man at this point in his life, probably in his 20s, and he is being accompanied across the street by a police officer, a white officer, wearing a helmet. This man is arresting John Lewis for protesting. Our second image connects to school desegregation. In the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. This ruling in 1954 results in the integration of our schools. Here we see an elementary school class. The children are young. They are of mixed race. The picture by the clothing is from the 1950s or early 60s. And they are all standing and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, or they might be singing My Country 'Tis of Thee. There's a flag on the right-hand corner, and you can see sheet music and a piano in the background. Our next set of images from the Civil Rights Movement relate to the Selma Freedom Marches. The Selma to Montgomery March was part of a series of civil rights protests that occurred in 1965 in Alabama. In the first picture on the right, we see a multi-ethnic group of whites and blacks marching on a street. There's a white priest, as well as John Lewis is marching here. He's wearing a suit, and you also see Martin Luther King in the foreground. He is also wearing a suit. They're all dressed up in fine clothes. At this point, it looks like a peaceful protest, and there are hundreds of people behind them. The next image on the right, that is in front of a mattress store, we see what happens next. There are white police officers with batons and riot helmets, and they are attacking the protesters. There are perhaps, in this image, 10 police officers attacking the crowd of marchers. In the foreground, we see John Lewis on the ground, head over his hands, about to be arrested, and it looks like possibly hit with a baton by one of the police officers. The next image from the civil rights era relates to the Greensboro sit-in when 4 black students refused to move from a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in 1960. This nationwide student activism gained momentum. In the image, we can see college African-American students. In this particular picture, it looks like a majority of women, although closest to the right-hand corner, we see an African-American man. They're all college students, they're African-Americans, and they're sitting at a lunch counter waiting to be served. No one's serving them. Behind them gathers a crowd of white people, including police officers. Our next image is of the famous March for Jobs and Freedom, or the March on Washington, that occurred in 1963. Over 200,000 people marched in protest for freedom and jobs for African Americans. In this scene, we can see a large crowd, again, multi-ethnic, whites and blacks, men and women. Many of them are dressed in what used to be called their Sunday finery. So they're dressed like they're going someplace fancy, and they're in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is a Greek-style building with many columns in the front. And we can't see this in the image, but inside is the statue of Lincoln sitting down. Our final image from the civil rights era is of Lyndon B. Johnson, the Texas Democrat who was president in 1965, as he signs into law the Voting Rights Act. He is surrounded by some of the white congressmen who helped pass this legislation. He's turning around, handing a pen to civil rights leader and icon Martin Luther King and shaking his hand. This is the moment when Lyndon Johnson signed into law the the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which broke down some of the barriers that were preventing African Americans from voting. The last image that's related to elections is of the election of 2020. Here we have a color photo, and in it we have a group of African Americans. One man has a microphone, and he is apparently speaking to a crowd of people. They're holding signs saying, "Vote today." Some of the people, because it's the era of COVID, have masks on them. This image is meant to convey the 30 million people of African American ethnicity who voted in the 2020 election.